In the last episode, episode 50 of the Pax Romana podcast, we talked about the Antonine Plague, the world's first pandemic, a disease of unknown origin and diagnosis that struck the Roman Empire under Marcus Aurelius around AD 165. I mentioned in that episode that it's not as though the pandemic was the sole cause of the end of the Pax Romana. In fact, it was just one of many factors. I want to spend some time now looking at some of those other factors. Today, I want to talk about something that is so basic, so elemental to the prosperity of any society, that it is easy to forget and take it for granted. And that is the food supply. And what's especially interesting about the food supply is that it started to go badly well before the end of the Pax Romana. We'll talk about what happened on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 51, Climate Change and Famine in the Pax Romana. Hey listeners, thanks again for tuning into the show. If you are a new listener, this is episode 51. We've had 50 episodes prior to this, and I encourage you to just start from the beginning. For the large part, this podcast is a story. It is told in an order. You can catch any episode independent of the other episodes, but there is an overarching narrative that begins all the way back at episode 1. So if you haven't yet, go ahead and check out that episode. If you're catching this on the morning or the day that it's uploaded, you still have time to check out my talk for Smithsonian Associates, and that talk will be on Agrippina, Empress of Rome, Mother of Nero. Just search for my name, Colin Elliott, and the title, Agrippina, Empress of Rome, Mother of Nero, or search for my name and Smithsonian Associates, and you'll find a link to the talk. It is ticketed, so it does cost money. If you want to hear what I have said about Agrippina on this podcast, I encourage you to check the back catalog. I dedicated 3 episodes to her story early on, so check those out. And I think that's it in terms of announcements. Let's go ahead and get to today's episode. The economy of the Roman Empire was heavily dependent upon agriculture, and in turn, agriculture was heavily dependent upon climate. Rome enjoyed some important agricultural technologies, for sure. Water wheels, for example, being among the most important, but also forms of irrigation, sophisticated crop rotation systems, and even types of crops that were fairly robust. All of these things still could not combine to liberate the Roman Empire from their climatological context in the way that we see technology doing this in large part today. And so it matters whether some parts of the Roman Empire were receiving the amounts of sunlight and precipitation that enabled them to produce. And as it turns out, well ahead of the Antonine Plague and the years which we identify as the collapse of the Pax Romana, decades ahead of that, in fact, there were some signs in the Roman climate and in the food system that should have been cause for alarm, but those indicators were largely ignored. In some ways, Roman officials probably were not even aware of the problem. And so even during the best years of the Pax Romana, the Roman Empire was already marching towards a very different fate in just a few decades. Cereal crops were vitally important to the Roman system. Wheat, barley, and other cereals were staples both for the diet of many people, but also for animals. By the time Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus took over the Roman Empire in the AD 160s, there was a kind of hierarchy in the food system. The city of Rome, with its over 1 million people, was largely fed by the province of Egypt. And I'll explain why in just a moment. After Egypt, the next 2 major breadbaskets were in the Western Mediterranean. One was North Africa, which Rome had acquired following the Punic Wars with Carthage back in the days of the Roman Republic. And then the oldest breadbasket for the Romans was Sicily, which they acquired after the very first war with Carthage in the middle of the 3rd century BC. Between those 3 breadbaskets, Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily, Rome was able to feed the population of the city of Rome and also the populations of many of the capitals of the empire. City of Carthage, city of Lugdunum, Ephesus, Alexandria, Pergamum, and a variety of other major cities were fed, at least in part, by those bread baskets. Of course, this is the Mediterranean, and grain was grown all over for local consumption. But those three bread baskets were vitally important. And as I said, for Rome, Egypt seems to have been the most important. And for more on the importance of Egypt to Rome, you can read the excellent book by Paul Erdkamp on the grain market in the Roman Empire. So why was Egypt so important? Why did it take over as the chief breadbasket despite being farther away from Rome than the other two, than Sicily and North Africa? It has to do with climate. It has to do with global climate. So in the Mediterranean, you have a wide variety of microclimates, very small regional variances based on elevation, based on proximity to the sea, based on latitude. There are a variety of factors that just cause certain regions to do well in terms of precipitation, sunlight, and crop growth, while a neighboring region just a few miles away does poorly in the exact same season. You could have a set of fields in one part of Italy in March do just fine, but then a few valleys over, it just gets a few degrees hotter or a little bit drier, and this is enough to ruin parts of the crop. And that transition from spring to summer in the Mediterranean could go badly in some regions and whole crops would be lost. At any given time, there were localized food shortages in the Roman world. The historian Peter Garnsey estimates that 1 out of every 3 years, you could expect food shortage or even famine in the Roman world. Now, I don't know if it's that much or not, but that was his estimate. The point is, food insecurity was prevalent in the Mediterranean. Egypt, in part, changed that situation because Egypt's grain fields were not fed by the same climate mechanisms of the rest of the Mediterranean. Egypt's fields were watered by the Nile. Every summer, the Nile would flood and douse the fields with water. It was really just a matter of keeping the canals and irrigation channels clean and making sure to monitor the flood level as it rose in the late summer. And those floodwaters came from over 1,000 miles south in equatorial East Africa. So we're talking most of what is now the modern state of Ethiopia. Every summer, that region just gets doused with rain. Well, most summers. It runs down those mountains, it collects silt and nitrates and other nutrients, and then it just, in a torrent, goes down the Blue Nile and then into the Nile proper, and it washes all the way down into Egypt, and it brings all that water and all those nutrients into the soil afresh every single year. We have pretty good evidence for flood records in Egypt, which show that for the most part, during the first 100 years of the Pax Romana, those floods were pretty reliable. They came almost every year. They came in amounts which were sufficient to water most fields in Egypt. The canals were kept clean. It was not a problem. And so Egypt was just abundantly fertile. So despite the fact that it was much further from Rome and it took a lot of effort to transport all that grain such a long distance, it ended up being worth it because of how reliable it was. And the Roman state helped do this by means of exercising state power. So the Emperor Claudius and the Emperor Trajan, I mentioned this on the podcast, and the Emperor Antoninus Pius all invested in the ports in Italy. And that was largely to accommodate larger and larger grain ships coming from Egypt full of Egyptian grain. We have records of laws during the 1st and 2nd century of the Pax Romana underwriting the cargoes of large grain ships. So if those ships or their cargoes happened to be lost on the journey to Rome, the state would pay for the loss. That's how invested the Roman state became in the Egyptian grain market because it was so reliable. Now, it's interesting, and I detail this, and you can see the charts in my book, Pax Romana, mostly in the 2nd chapter of that book. I'm sure that if you look at the 2nd chapter on Google Books, if you don't want to buy the book, you can probably find them there. You don't have to buy the book. But if you look at charts of proxies for the ancient climate, and by that I mean things like tree rings. We can measure the tree rings each and every year of very ancient trees, and we can determine years of good precipitation and good sunlight and years in which there were far less of those things. And we can track those in certain regions. So we have fairly old trees in parts of Northern Europe, in Austria, and also in Finland. We have trees in parts of North America that are that old, like bristlecone pines in southern Colorado. We have cave speleothems, so stalagmites and stalactites that grow over the course of time, and their growth can be measured and dated so we can get a sense of what years there was more precipitation and what years there weren't. Now, those aren't as accurate as tree rings. Paleoclimatologists have also drilled cores like they do out of the ice in bogs and lakes, and you can measure the pollen that fell at the lake bottom every year and get a sense as to how much growth there was in the wildlife in the area around the lake, and therefore roughly how much precipitation and sunlight there was. So there are a lot of ways to measure climate over the course of many, many thousands of years. And what's interesting is that several of these proxies that have connections in some way to the climate of Egypt and the degree of rainfall that would have contributed to the Nile flood, for example, what we see is that around the 150s, there was a noticeable change. And so Egypt, which had been reliable for generations, suddenly became less so. And it didn't matter whether the emperors continued to underwrite the ships. It didn't matter how large the ports were in Rome. It didn't matter even that the Roman state began to compel ship owners to transport grain even when it wasn't profitable to them, which happened in the late Pax Romana. None of that mattered because the grain just simply was not growing in the numbers that it had been in Egypt prior to this. And some of the indicators in other parts of the Mediterranean, like tree rings in Northern Europe or proxies for storm activity in the Western Mediterranean, some of those other proxies suggest that other regions, some of the regions that might have served as a backup if things in Egypt went badly, some of those other regions began to experience environmental stress around the same time, right around the 150s AD. Now, Roman authorities were very good at storing grain. There were huge storehouses in Rome. Many other cities stored grain for the long term in the event of the odd food shortage or famine. But the problems that began in the 150s were much longer lasting than any that had occurred before. Based on the evidence that I looked at for my book, the period of low rainfall and likely low agricultural production in Egypt and other parts of the Roman Empire appeared to last 20 to 30 years. Now, that doesn't mean every year was bad. There were some good years, but there were a lot more bad years. About every other year was bad during the second half of the 2nd century. And that just had not been the case at any other time in the Pax Romana. Now, there are some consequences to such a big failure in the food supply. One, of course, is malnutrition. People in the cities that were very dependent upon imports of grain from other parts of the Roman world, those people suffered. And of course, malnourishment is correlated with lower levels of general population immunity, making people in the cities that suffered the most during this period more susceptible to diseases, including the disease responsible for the Antonine plague. So that is one consequence. Another consequence is, in order to supplement the grain supply, it may have been the case, and we don't have much direct evidence for this. This is partly my own speculation. But in order to compensate for the reduced productivity of the grain supply, Roman authorities may have redirected, perhaps through compulsion, existing resources that were being used for other things, like quarrying stone, like mining metals, transporting timber, producing and distributing other goods in the Roman economy. those resources were likely redeployed for dealing with the grain supply. One of the places I think we see this happening is under the Emperor Commodus, Marcus Aurelius' son. He deploys a bunch of large ships to Africa to regularly transport grain. Because by the time that he's emperor, everybody realizes that Egypt simply is not going to produce at the levels that it had been before, and something else needed to be done. It's interesting that we have quarry stoppages, mine stoppages, massive reductions in shipwrecks at this time, suggesting lower volume of shipping in the Mediterranean in general. Some of those phenomena are no doubt a result of deaths from the Antonine plague, but it's probably also the case that the economy of Rome in general is under strain and is simply producing and distributing far less than it had just a few decades earlier. But then, of course, what grain are these resources now transporting? Because again, Egypt is not producing as much. Well, what's probably happening is taxes in kind, that is in grain, not in money, but taxes in crops, are being extracted more ruthlessly in the rural parts of the Roman Empire. And suddenly small-scale farmers that normally just fed themselves and then used their extra to pay taxes were being squeezed to the point where they could not produce, not only for the state, but not even for themselves. They may have had to sell or abandon their land because they were facing starvation. They could not grow the food that they needed to eat, let alone the grain that they needed to pay taxes. And so they fled into the cities looking for a handout. But of course, the cities themselves were already under strain because their bread baskets were failing as well. So you can see already that food supply and climate are perhaps even more fundamental than disease, and certainly would have worked in combination with disease to create serious problems in the Roman Empire. And as we'll talk about next time, the Roman Empire was not the only place that was affected by these changes in climate. To the north of the Romans, the Germanic peoples of Northern Europe, with their nomadic lifestyle, also found life harder as the climate began to change. And so they too migrated and moved down into the Roman Empire, causing the outbreak of a major war, the Marco-Mannic War. And we'll talk about that conflict and its monumental impact on the Pax Romana on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.